Party people, APUSH, 2016-2017. Here we go with the Civil War, 1861 to 1865. Um, the best way to start this out is with some humor, since that's what we're all about. Here's the gym in December where it's empty, and then the gym in January. I started going to the gym after Christmas, and this was my New Year's resolution to get a little bit healthier. So here's what I look like now. New year, new me. Get it? Alright. So for the United States in 1860, there would be no more resolutions after the election of 1860. Lincoln, who will be elected with only 40% of the popular vote, is the candidate in the North and doesn't even exist on the ballots in most of the southern states for the election of 1860. He's against slavery in all of the new territory, which comes back from dates back to that Wilmot Proviso by David Wilmot during the Mexican-American War, and he is morally opposed to slavery. Then you have Stephen Douglas, who Lincoln lost to in the Senate election in Illinois. I don't know if that... Oops. Okay. All right, we're back. And he is for popular sovereignty. So what happened with Bleeding Kansas and what leads up to the Civil War here, Douglas is still holding on to popular sovereignty as the people's choice to be able to allow slavery or deny slavery in these new territories. Then you have John Breckinridge, who is pro-slavery from the South, and that effectively splits the Democrat Party into two, Northern Democrats and Southern Democrats. And that's what allows Lincoln to be able to have victory. So that's what you got to remember here about the election of 1860. The Democrat Party splits into two, North and South. Here's the election results. Maybe not. I can't get out of here. There we go. So in the blue, you can see all the northern states there and the far western states with Oregon and California. Lincoln wins those. And then you have the middle here, which is Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, who go for the brand new political party, the Constitutional Union, and that forms basically right before the election, and they just don't want to do anything with slavery, which is key here because if you're looking at Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, they're in the middle between the North and the South, or at least the Deep South and the Upper North. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. And then you have Douglas, who wins Missouri and part of New Jersey for the Northern Democrat Party. And then the South is dominated by Breckinridge and those that want to extend slavery and hold on to slavery. If you look at the popular vote there, 40%. Lincoln gets the majority of the popular vote for all four candidates, but only 40% of the people vote for Lincoln, which is pretty remarkable to be able to win with only 40% of the vote. But he does get 180 electoral votes, which makes him the President of the United States. The areas of New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, those have the most people, and so they carry the most weight here within the election, which allows Lincoln to win. Okay, and that leads directly to South Carolina leaving the Union. They decide to secede or break away from the Union. The first of the southern states that do that right after the election of Lincoln in 1860. Lincoln's not inaugurated until March 4th, 1861, so they have this time period from November to March in which Lincoln is the president-elect, and during that time period, South Carolina decides that they no longer want to be part of the United States, and it will lead to other states seceding as well. So, Civil War, no one will push the Union around without a fight. Okay, so here's the progression of secession. What we're looking at here first in this slide is the states that secede before the fall of Fort Sumner. So those that are in blue: South Carolina, then you got Alabama, Mississippi, then Georgia, Florida, Texas, Louisiana. Those far southern states where most of the slaves were being held and working in those plantations growing cotton. That is where they secede first. Okay. So then you have Fort Sumner and other federal um, lands that were in the South that became a huge issue. And as the Confederate States elect their president, Jefferson Davis, they want to get control of those federal lands. And so the Union will resist, and they will keep hold of those federal forts and territories. And one of them here is in Fort Sumner. And so then you'll get the battle here at Fort Sumner, 1861, from April 12th to April 13th. I'm going to show you a little video here that'll explain Fort Sumner. Hang with me. Here we go.
When we think of Fort Sumter, we think about the opening of the Civil War, the first shots fired. This is a fortification in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. And on April 12, 1861, a bombardment began that did initiate the conflict between the Union and the new Confederate States. But really, this story does begin with the secession crisis. Secession starts in December of 1860 in South Carolina. It's a response to Lincoln's election. The Republicans taking power scares a lot of the slaveholding interests in the South. Ultimately, 7 states will form the Confederacy in early 1861, and they will threaten federal fortifications in different harbors across the Atlantic coast and into the Gulf Coast. Harbors like Charleston, South Carolina, where there are federal fortifications and federal troops. Some say they can't hold the forts in the harbor, so they should withdraw altogether. Others say that they should resupply and reprovision the forts and try to launch an offensive. Then there's a middle way, an idea that perhaps if they offer a humanitarian relief, offer provisions but not arms, they might be able to prevent the Confederates from firing on the fort but still have symbolic hold of the fortification in the harbor. That's what Lincoln decides to do. He notifies the Confederate government, which he still doesn't recognize as legitimate, through back channels that he plans to re-provision the fort with humanitarian supplies. The Confederates decide they're not going to allow this to happen. They considered an aggressive act against their sovereign claims. And so General Pierre Beauregard orders the surrender of the fort. Major Anderson declines to do so. On April 12th, Beauregard's forces begin a bombardment. It's going to last for about 34 hours. During that bombardment, both sides are firing away at each other. No one is killed. But clearly, Anderson and his men don't have enough provisions, supplies, or armaments to hold out against it, and so Anderson is forced to negotiate a surrender. The Confederates took control of Sumter, and this is what launches the American Civil War. Young people in large...
Okay, so Charleston Harbor, South Carolina is Fort Sumner. You're going to need to remember that. That's the first battle here of the Civil War. In which the federal troops held the harbor, the fort at the harbor, and are attacked by the South by P.T. Beauregard and his men. After this, you have a huge enlistment on both sides. So, as the Confederates are forming their own country, as they secede from the Union, they will get a large number of volunteers, and men will want to fight for the preservation of their way of life in the South. And in the North, you get Lincoln, who will get thousands of men to be able to volunteer to fight for the Union Army. And it's over this event here at Fort Sumter. Okay, so then now we're looking at this map again, and I want you to focus on the gray areas, states that seceded after the fall of Fort Sumner. So you have then Arkansas, Tennessee, North Carolina, and Virginia, which are all southern states, which all have slavery within their constitutions. They all begin to now join the Confederacy. So all the blue, the dark blue, and the gray have become the Confederate States of America. But the teal color are border states that have slaves that don't join the Confederate States, and they stay neutral, and eventually they will become the border states that make up an essential part of the Union Army because they will not join the Confederacy. And let's look and see why they're important and how that happens. So you need to write these down. Border states are Maryland, Delaware, Missouri, and Kentucky, and eventually they will join the Union. That'll be on your quiz. You need to remember that. So Richmond becomes the capital as they move it to about 100 miles south of where Washington, D.C. is, which is the capital of the United States, or the Union. So 100 miles separates the two capitals between now what the United States, or the Union, Lincoln calls the rebel states. It doesn't recognize them as their own country or their secession being legal. But they're 100 miles apart as far as their capitals. And if Maryland did not join the Union, then Washington, D.C. would have been in the South. And that would have completely changed the outlook of the war right away. Okay, so you have the two sides and the two presidents. Jefferson Davis, you'll need to remember him for your quiz also, as the leader of the Confederate States, Confederate States of America. And he comes from West Point as a West Point graduate, in which most of these generals will as well for the North and the South. But he's not really a military expert. And he's got tons of problems as far as being able to get these southern states who all wanted their independence to be able to come together for the same purpose. And that states' rights issue plagues the South and their secession within the Civil War, and their ability to be able to unify within their efforts. So he spends too much attention on details and doesn't allow people to be able to do their jobs. So he fails at delegation and is more of a micromanager. Comparing to Lincoln on the other side, who is considered this great thinker and analyzer of all kinds of different situations and events and people, and being able to manage all of those things together. He does expand the army without congressional authority, as Congress wasn't around at the time, so he just expanded it on his own. And he will implement martial law and suspend the writ of habeas corpus and do a lot of these things that are empowered to him within the Constitution in a time of war or a threat to the United States. So we'll look at those as we go through too. Okay, so you got the South, which is the stars and bars there on the left, the Confederate flag, and then the flag of the United States with the 35 stars representing here from 1863. And the South, their goal is to preserve their way of life, which includes slavery. There's many issues that lead to the Civil War that we talked about. Slavery is the main one. And their states' rights and Southern economy and all those things will be issues, but preserving the way of life is another way of saying holding on to slavery. North, Lincoln's objective is to preserve the Union, and that's what he states to the American people, and that's what helps those border states be able to join the Union and not secede like the other southern states have already. Now, I'm gonna argue that ending slavery is also his objective, and I think that's pretty evident with the amount of evidence there is. But you got to remember that what he expresses within his view is that preserving the Union is the first and foremost objective of the North. And you got to remember that for your quiz, so don't forget that. All right, now my argument is that he's going to abolish slavery as well. That the two things are conjoined from the start, and you can't do one without the other. You can't hold on to the Union and not abolish slavery, and um, so those things I would say have to go arm in arm, as you see here. Here's another meme for you. You're welcome. All right, so the South again on the left side. Their goal is to preserve their way of life, and this is how they're going to be able to accomplish that goal. They're going to fight a defensive war. And you're going to see a lot of similarities, or you can compare the Civil War to the War for Independence or the Revolutionary War that we had discussed and learned about earlier on in the year. But they're just gonna secede, and the North has to come to them, and they can defend their own territory. They're hoping that there's going to be help coming from either Great Britain and or France, just like the United States, as they formed their country, um, got help from France to defeat Great Britain. The South is depending on the possibility of one of those European countries because of the dependence on cotton. So France, Great Britain, and their industries wouldn't be able to survive. So the South says they're going to need our cotton, and they're going to come to the defense of the South to make sure that they obtain that cotton. Now that's not going to happen, but that's their hope. And then the other hope is that they wear out the North, and the North will just eventually give up. And a battle of attrition, a battle that lasts too long, that becomes unpopular, that the North just turns on Lincoln and the politicians and says, "Hey, we've had enough. Let's come to a compromise. Let's give up. Let's end this in some way." And that almost has some truth to it here, but we'll see why that wasn't necessarily a good strategy as well. On the north side, Winfield Scott is going to come up with the Anaconda Plan. And if you know what anacondas do, they are these big snakes that will just squeeze the life out of you. And that's the whole plan of the North, is to set up a blockade, not allow cotton out, not allow manufactured goods in to the South, and therefore the South will just slowly die within this war and be forced to give up and surrender. There's not too much intention of the lives that are lost. There's somewhere between 680,000 and 800,000 men that are estimated to die during this war, but that's not what was expected by either the South or the North going into these battles. The North thought they could get them to surrender, and the South thought they could get them to surrender in their different ways. And the more effective one here is the North with the blockade, using their navy to not allow southern shipping of cotton and foreign countries to be able to import things into. So control of the Mississippi River, and then being able to attack from the north and make them submit. Those become the goals of the North. So here's Winfield Scott's Anaconda Plan within a map. As you can see visually here, all of the ships that are blockading the harbors, and specifically New Orleans on the very south, and cutting the South into two different parts. You have Arkansas and Louisiana that would be split from Mississippi and Alabama. You have Texas on the other side, eventually Arizona. Those would all be cut off from each other, and then taking that blockade and then invading from the north would be able to get the Southerners to submit. Here's your Winfield Scott Anaconda Plan meme. Hopefully this will get you to remember it. Might want to remember it for your quiz. Okay, so military operations. We're not going to talk about a whole lot of battles. We'll focus on a few of them. We're not going to talk about a bunch of the details of the battles, or really how the wars specifically fought and won, but we'll look at just basic things. So both of them will use cavalry, which is horses, not in large amounts, but just for moving quickly from one area to another with a small amount of men. And basically, they use it for scouting and raiding. Right, you're going to destroy something that is vital to the other side, or be able to know where they're going using your horses, your cavalry. And disrupting supply and communication lines was key. The North is extremely good at being able to resupply their men because they have the railroads, because they have roads that they built in the previous generations in which the South neglected. But the South will try to disrupt those by destroying railroads and causing the North to slow down a little bit. So destroying roads, bridges, that kind of stuff became common military operations on both sides. Here is the South versus the North as far as their advantages and disadvantages. You have a far greater number of people living in the North than in the South. And remember that a portion of the South is slaves. And those slaves would not necessarily be good during a war for the South as far as fighting. They wouldn't be used. And if the husbands or the men are going away to fight, then it's less likely for the slaves to be able to do what they had done before without people overseeing them. So factories, you have all of the production basically coming from the North, and that will severely hurt the South within their inability to manufacture their own goods for the war. Railroads, I mentioned, were a major advantage as the North continued to build railroads during the Civil War to connect themselves to the farther west as well. And then the banks that the South had never seen a use for. Those became ways in which the North could fund specific things that the war needed. All right, so supplies, you don't have to write this down. Supplies needed for an army of 100,000. It's 600 tons of supplies daily, 2,500 wagons, 35,000 horses and mules to be able to move these people and their goods and their weapons and the cannons and all kinds of stuff that they needed. Becomes a logistic nightmare for the South as the war drags on and they don't necessarily have all the things that they need. Okay, so how do they fund the war? And they're going to have two different ways, one that the North does and one that the South does. And let's look at see how they do this here. So the North, I'll put on the left side here, volunteer efforts, in which both will have specifically right away thousands of men on both sides, but specifically the North wanting to fight to preserve the Union. They will sell war bonds. Basically, you're betting or gambling on the North or the Union to win. If the South wins, you don't get this money. If the North wins, you'll get your money plus your interest. So those become war bonds. Legal Tender Act, which is Lincoln's way of unifying all of the states in the North through one monetary system. And it's much easier now to be able to get these things passed through Congress because all of the Southern senators and Southern representatives are gone. So the Legal Tender Act becomes very important as far as unifying the system of money in the North. The National Bank is brought back, and that again will help stabilize the economy in the North. It will use a moral tariff, which will set up land grants, which we'll talk about a little bit later. The Homestead Act, again, will allow land to be bought basically for free, a licensing fee that allows people to acquire land in the North and specifically moving out west. And we'll talk about its impact in the next chapter as well. Income tax and a sales tax, so new taxes that are passed through Congress that allow money to be generated from its people and its efforts within the economy to pay for the war. On the South side, they printed their own money. Yes, they printed their own money. And that led to all kinds of problems. Number one being inflation, and so that was not a good choice for them. They had a draft. The North will have a draft as well. I didn't put that on the other side, but they will force people to be able to fight in the South, and the North will do that as well. And they will not implement any new taxes. The South was against taxes. They were against tariffs. They were against all that. They were for all kinds of liberty and freedom, and they were unwilling to change. They were unwilling to unify, and this will backfire for the South for years to come. Okay, so power will shift from states to the federal government. This is important to remember. During the Civil War here, these things will become federal laws that take away those states' rights and those liberties of individual states to be able to have a say in government, and will implement the federal government's will upon them. And so martial law is used, and what that is the army of the Union will make sure that the people in the border states stay within the Union, and that will allow them to basically rule the people that are there during this time of the war. Suspending the writ of habeas corpus, holding these people that were pro-Confederates in these border states, allowed Lincoln to secure and keep those border states from flipping and seceding. And so basically he'll put people in jail and hold them there without any trial, without due process, and it is within the Constitution for him to be able to do that. But it does shift power away from the states and gives it to the federal government in the form of the presidency. The bank and the Legal Tender Act create a national currency. This is the greenbacks. This is the money that we look at today that has become a unified system in which states didn't have their own money. It became the federal government that issued the money. And then taxes that we talked about before all shift power from states to the federal government. All right, remember those. All right, looking at the northern advantages going into the war and during the war. They had an established government. Everything was already set up. The South had to create all of these things, but the North just continued from what it was, but it became more unified as it left out all of the congressmen that were from the South, because they were no longer part of the government at this time. They had established military. Everything was already there, ready to go. They had a larger population. They had industry. They were able to manufacture all kinds of stuff in which the South didn't have the capability to do that. They always depended on the exportation of cotton to other places, and they never focused on industry, and that will make them suffer here during the Civil War. So the ability to make guns and weapons was what the North had. The South didn't have that. They could make textiles. They could make uniforms. They could make boots. They could make all kinds of stuff that supplied what the Army needed. So there's boots, footwear, railroads. They continue to make railroads connecting west and north together. And they had a large amount of money that they could borrow through these other ways of taxes and the bank and war bonds that we talked about before. So the South's advantages, they're fighting for independence, and these will be similar to what we looked at with the Revolutionary War. They have that motivation. They have that home field advantage. All they have to do is defend themselves. The North has to take the offensive and come and make the South submit or make them give up. So they're fighting on their home soil. They know the territory. And they have much better leaders. As you look at the historians look back at the Civil War, the decisions that are made by Lee and Jackson, and these military leaders were far superior until you get to the elevation of Grant, maybe at the end of the war. All right, so the first battle of Bull Run, July 21st, 1861. This is Pierre Beauregard, or P.T. Beauregard again, who's led the assault on Fort Sumter, versus General Irvin McDowell and the Union forces. Um, the North will have names of their battles, and the South will have different names of their battles based on the place. Um, and so it's in Manassas, and that's um, Virginia, where this is happening, and it'll be a victory for the South. So the Union will lose this Battle of Bull Run. The first battle, there'll be a second one, they lose that one as well. But here's a little painting of the Battle of Bull Run. I think there's a video. I'm going to stop this for now and then go version 2. So hang on.